Hi, and welcome to Do You Speak Jewish? This mini course is a brief romp through the wonderful world of Jewish languages. When I say Jewish languages, most people think of Hebrew, Yiddish, and Ladino, and those are the ones we're actually going to focus on today. But there's actually a whole collection of world languages that have Jewish dialects, and we'll be talking a little bit about them as well. This map provides a pretty good visual illustration of both the number of Jewish languages that exist and also how they have spread across the globe. You can see how they travel sometimes from one place to another. So, for example, we have in the pink in Spain, Judeo-Espanol, which of course is also known as Ladino or Judesmo. And you can see how it travels from Spain up into the Netherlands, down across the Mediterranean into Greece and Turkey, and even into North Africa, the tip of North Africa in Morocco, where it is known as Haketia, which is a dialect of Ladino. That's one way that you can trace how the languages move. You can see the same thing with Yiddish, which starts a little bit in Italy and northern France, and then progresses all the way into Eastern Europe, into Russia and Ukraine and Poland. And you can see that there are even Judeo-English languages, a Jewish English that comes from England and also the United States and Canada. You find a version of it in South Africa and a version of it in Australia. And you can see that there are just so many different languages that grew out of the experience of living in a diaspora community and adapting that language to Jewish culture. And you see it in really odd and interesting places. You see Judeo-Aramaic in what was the old Babylonian community in Iraq. You see Judeo-Malayalam, which is a dialect in southern western India. You see Judeo-Russian. You see Judeo-Tajik spoken in Tajikistan. That's a version of Judeo-Persian, which is a collection of languages spoken throughout the old Persian Empire. And you can see that pretty much in every place where Jews have lived, they have adapted the language of their host community and made it a specifically Jewish kind of thing. The one thing that's missing on this map is Ethiopia, because the Amharic spoken by the Bene Yisrael in Ethiopia is a different dialect than regular Amharic. So I don't know why it's not on the map, but Judeo-Amharic should also be here. Hebrew, of course, is the first Jewish language. It's foundational. And we look at Hebrew over the course of its development over four large, broad periods. The first, the oldest, is Biblical Hebrew. And within Biblical Hebrew, there are really three strata. Archaic Hebrew, which dates from the 10th to 8th centuries BCE. We have only a couple of small texts in the Bible that reflect this language. There have also been some archaeological finds that reflect it. And then there's Standard Biblical Hebrew, which is from the 8th to 6th centuries BCE. This is the language that most of the Bible is written in. Certainly the entirety of the Torah is in this basic standard language. And then there's late Biblical Hebrew, which is from the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE. This is the post-Babylonian exile version of Hebrew, and it contains an awful lot of influences from Aramaic, the language of Babylon. With the close of the biblical period, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. And we also have Mishnaic or Rabbinic Hebrew, which is roughly from the 1st to 3rd or 4th centuries CE. Mishnaic Hebrew, Rabbinic Hebrew, is probably very close to the spoken language of the late biblical period. We don't know what the spoken language was like, but we can theorize that the kind of spokenisms that you find in Mishnaic Hebrew, those probably were fairly common in the late biblical period. Following that, we have medieval Hebrew, which is highly influenced by Arabic. And we find it in the 4th to 18th centuries. By the end of the medieval period, it's being influenced as much by Latin and French as it is by Arabic, but Arabic produced a lot of influence, especially early in the medieval period. And then we have modern Hebrew, which really began to revive in the 19th century, and of course it continues to the present day. Hebrew itself has its own origin story. It is located on the northwest branch of the Semitic language family. It's part of the Canaanite language cluster. It's very much related to Phoenician. In fact, Old Hebrew writing, really ancient Hebrew writing, is almost indistinguishable from Phoenician. They use the same writing system with very few changes. It's also very much related to Ugaritic, and as I said, it's part of the Canaanite family. Moabite is certainly very, very close to biblical Hebrew as well. And Hebrew then, of course, is then related to all of the other Semitic languages. Arabic, very closely related to Arabic, which is from the South Semitic side, South Central. And it's more distantly related to Amharic and the languages of Ethiopia, and also to the East Semitic languages like Akkadian or Babylonian. Things were going along fairly swimmingly in the land of Israel, at least as far as Hebrew was concerned, until the great empires of the ancient world began their conquests of the land and began dispersing the Jewish population to what eventually became the four corners of the earth. The first of these was the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom and the scattering of those. Later, we had the Babylonian conquest of Judea. We know that in 586 BCE, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem, destroyed the city, demolished Solomon's temple, and carted most of the intellectual leadership out of Judea and into Babylon in present-day Iraq. We know that the language of Babylon was Aramaic, not Hebrew, and the Jewish community soon adopted that language as their own, but they made it very Jewish in nature. It had tons of Hebrew words intermixed into it, and we also know that that became the basis for the Talmud. Fortunately, that first diaspora didn't last forever. About 60 years after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians, and the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great allowed many delegations of Jews to return to Judea and rebuild the country. Upon their return, Hebrew again became the language of the land of Israel, but it had a lot of Aramaic mixed into it, brought over from the Babylonian experience. Most of the Jewish community stayed in Babylon, although a pretty significant portion also moved into Persia, and there they followed the same pattern that they had in Babylon. They adopted ancient Persian as their day-to-day language, but again, it was a Persian that was not strictly Persian. It had a lot of Hebrew mixed in. It had some Aramaic mixed in, and it became known as Judeo-Persian. Back in Israel, Hebrew is moving along, although Aramaic is certainly the lingua franca of the region. It's the language of international trade, and things go well there until, of course, the Greeks show up, and then subsequently the Romans show up. And the Romans, we know, destroyed again the kingdom, the Jewish kingdom, Jewish autonomy, and in 70 CE, they put down the first great uprising against them and carted a huge portion of the Jewish population into the Roman Empire. And that became the second great dispersion of the Jewish community. There are certain hallmarks that we find in Jewish languages. These are things that were certainly present in both the Babylonian Aramaic of the Jewish community and also the Judeo-Persian of the Jewish community in ancient Persia. The first is that Jewish languages have a non-Jewish base language. In the case of Babylon, it was Aramaic. In the case of Persia, it was Persian. And this will be repeated throughout history, as we'll see shortly. Next, it has a huge number of Hebrew and/or Hebrew and Aramaic components. These are usually words, sometimes phrases, and so on, borrowed from Hebrew into the non-Jewish language base. There are also influences from other previous Jewish languages. In the case of modern borrowings, these tend to come from Yiddish or Ladino. There are some other distinctive features, such as vowel pronunciation and certain discourse styles, such as overlapping speech, which non-Jews tend to perceive as interrupting, but it is a discourse style that we find within the Jewish community. And Hebrew, the Hebrew writing system, was generally used for writing in the non-Jewish base language. This is not the case where Aramaic was concerned. Ancient Hebrew had a different writing system than the one we use today. The one we use today was actually borrowed from Aramaic. So the Hebrew alphabet that we all know is actually the Aramaic alphabet. But that is the one time that the alphabet from a different language has come to influence Hebrew. By the Middle Ages, we have huge numbers of Judeo languages popping up all over the Mediterranean and Europe. We have Judeo-Arabic showing up in North Africa and in the Arab world. We have Yavanit in the Romaniot communities in Greece. We have Judeo-Espanol, Judeo-Spanish in Spain, and Judeo-Portuguese, very closely related to Judeo-Spanish from Portugal. There is an Italian language called Laaz, which is Judeo-Italian. And then, of course, moving into Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, we find the Yiddish language groups and other related languages, some related to Judeo-Persian, showing up in the Caucasus Mountains and other parts. Bukhara, for example, has a related language to Persian. We also find Judeo-Arabic in the Yemenite community and Judeo-Amharic showing up with the Beta Israel in Ethiopia. We turn our attention now to the two diaspora Jewish languages that are most commonly known in the American Jewish community. The first is Judeo-Spanish, which goes by a number of names. It's most commonly called Ladino, but it is also known as Judezmo. Judezmo means Jewish. So if you ask, "Hablas Judezmo?" you are asking the person if they speak Jewish, which is, of course, the title of this particular mini course. Ladino is also known as Haketia in Morocco. It is a form of Ladino, a dialect of Ladino, that has a greater influence of Arabic. The origins of Ladino are a little unclear. There's a bit of debate about it amongst scholars, but we know that what we have in Ladino currently is 15th century Castiliano. So it's Castilian Spanish that after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497, it traveled along the Mediterranean and picked up vocabulary from Italian, from Arabic, and especially Turkish, Greek, and the Balkan languages, which is where the largest number of Ladino speakers settled. Originally, it was written in Rashi script. You can see the interior of the illustration. It actually spells Ladino in Rashi script, and it has been most commonly written in regular Hebrew script now in Israel. But starting in the 20th century, especially as Turkey adopted the Latin alphabet, so too did Ladino, especially within the Turkish community and any of the English-speaking countries. Ladino has an awful lot of borrowings from Hebrew. Words like gaon, meaning an expert or a scholar, or beitzim, which means eggs. And there are mixtures of Hebrew and Spanish. So, for example, el santo bendicho el. The first el in this means the, el santo bendicho, the sacred and blessed, and el in the last word in the phrase is from the Hebrew, meaning a word for God. We also find the phrases mazal bueno y mazal alto. Mazal bueno, good fortune, congratulations, and mazal alto, high congratulations. One of the ways that Ladino differs from modern Spanish is in the pronunciation of the J sound. Je is definitely a feature of Ladino pronunciation, of Ladino phonology. So in modern Spanish, the word for the woman is la mujer, but in Ladino it's la mujer. And Judezmo is also a sound that you would not encounter in modern Spanish. There's also some interesting things like flip-flopping of sounds within a word. That's known as metathesis. In modern Spanish, we say buenas tardes. In Ladino, it's buenas tardes. And there are also some changes in grammar. For example, there's no usted form in Ladino. These are huevos geminados. This is a really interesting combination. So we have huevos, which has dropped the H sound from huevos, meaning eggs. And the second word is geminados. It's a Hebrew term, hamin, meaning slow cooked, like cholent, with a Spanish suffix. These are a very common food amongst the Sephardic Jews. This is known as huevos geminados. These are slow-baked eggs that are cooked with onion skins, which create this beautiful brown coloring and kind of the marbling effect. Similar to Ladino is Judeo-German. Just as Ladino is Judeo-Spanish, so too Yiddish is Judeo-German. We don't know the complete origin story on Yiddish, but we do know that it has influences from northern Italy, from northern France especially, and that it is essentially Mittelhochdeutsch, medieval High German, Middle High German, that was influenced by these Romance languages, but then was also infused with Hebrew and Slavic. There are two major branches of Yiddish. One is the Eastern branch, which is the Galicianer branch, and the other is the Western or Litvak branch. The Litvak branch tends to rely more heavily on German. The Eastern branch tends to rely more on Slavic borrowings. Just like Ladino, Yiddish borrows a ton of words from Hebrew. In fact, it's close to 25% of the vocabulary in Yiddish is borrowed from Hebrew. The Slavic borrowings come from Polish and Russian, but especially Ukrainian. Interestingly enough, Yiddish is the only language I know of that has two words for potato. The first is Kartoffel, which is from German, and that is the preferred term for potato in the Western branch of Yiddish. And in the Eastern branch, we have Bulba, which is from Ukrainian. And just like Ladino, which makes compounds of Spanish and Hebrew words, Yiddish makes compounds of German and Hebrew words. So there are three terms in Yiddish for a luckless person. There's a shlemiel, a shlemazel, and a nebish. A shlemiel is someone who invariably dumps his soup on somebody. A shlemazel is the person who invariably has soup dumped on him. And a nebish is someone who picks up after a shlemiel. So the word shlemiel is a compound of German and Hebrew. It comes from the German schlimm, meaning not, and mazel, meaning luck. So someone with no luck is a schlemazel. We find that same kind of compound exactly in Ladino. We have mazal, fortune. We have ado, which is a person. A mazalado is a lucky person. But an unlucky person, we add the prefix des, meaning not, becomes desmazalado. A desmazalado and a schlemazel, they are very much the same kind of character. They are luckless. Not too surprisingly, because we've seen that we have Jewish diaspora dialects across the globe in virtually every community that the Jewish people have lived in. We also, not surprisingly, find that there is a dialect of English that can only be called Jewish English. And there are a number of places where we find Jewish English: the US, Canada, Britain, South Africa, Australia. And this particular kind of English is basic English base with an awful lot of Hebrew, Yiddish, and sometimes even a little Ladino thrown in. There's a lot of difference based on generation and region of the country, and of course all of the various types of Jewish folks that exist. So within the Orthodox world, there tends to be a lot of Yiddish thrown in, and also what is known as yeshivish, which is a kind of Hebrew that is very much Ashkenazi influenced, and it makes its way into all sorts of English statements. We also find that at summer camps, there are a lot of summer camps that are including Hebrew vocabulary, sometimes Yiddish vocabulary as well, mostly nouns, not verbs, so that the structure of the language grammatically remains absolutely English, but it is infused with a ton of Hebrew vocabulary. In fact, that is actually referred to as Hebrew infusion. And of course, like other languages, it incorporates Hebrew and Yiddish, and we find that there is a lot of overlapping, that Jews talking to each other, they tend to finish each other's sentences in this kind of overlapping conversation. But it's interesting to see just how incredibly Jewish some of this language can be. Dr. Sarah Bonin-Benor at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles has documented this pretty extensively, and this is one of the quotes that she has added to the research. I particularly love this because only a Jewish person could say this, and really only a Jewish person could understand it. And the quote is, "We do all that shtick to be mesameach the chassan and kala," which is, you know, what, 5 words in there out of this little sentence are Hebrew or Yiddish. So this is a kind of interesting admixture of vocabulary from Hebrew and Yiddish on top of an English base. So I want to conclude with a quote from one of our Gratz alumni, Noam Chomsky, whose dad, William Chomsky, was professor of Hebrew here at the college for many years. And Noam really made a beautiful statement about the importance of language. He said it's not just words, it's a culture, a tradition, a unification of a community, a whole history that creates what that community is. All of that is embodied in the language. And that is certainly true for Jewish languages. They're not just words. Jewish languages embody Jewish tradition, Jewish culture, and they have served to unify Jewish communities throughout our history as they do today. In essence, it's all of Jewish culture is embodied in Jewish language.